Thank you very much. Basically, in the 1980s, between Canada and the United States, we had about one accident every 2 days. It got better in the 90s, one accident a week, and in the 2000s, about one accident every 2 weeks. So things have gotten better, and I like to think it's because of better education. This is the latest I've received from, I believe it was the NTSB or the FAA. I can't remember where exactly I got this, but 87% of them were fatal over that 10-year period. So, okay, most of these accidents happen to GA pilots, private pilots, and most of those private pilots are on personal flights. The 13 I looked at, about half of them fit the profile of Gen Av pilots, but the other half were Part 135, and some of them even Part 91, but they were sort of a commercial operation, if you like. 5 of those private pilots, or at least those personal flights, I should say, 5 of those pilots were in their 60s or 70s. Just, I don't know if that means anything to you. So low-time pilots, but also very experienced commercial pilots. AOPA did a study, found that over a third involved pilots with 1,000 hours. And you know, you've probably been told this over and over again, that Alaska has the worst GA and commercial VFR IMC accident rate. So you can see almost half of them were commercial. 9 of the pilots had their commercial and or ATP. 9 out of the 13. Here's some of examples of the flight hours. 5,000 hours, 10,000, 25,000 hours. I'm sure the 25,000-hour pilot did not think, I'm sure none of those pilots thought they were going to die in this crash. And at one time, maybe 20 years ago actually, half of all air taxi and 2/3 of all fatal commuter accidents in Alaska were this type of accident. And at one point, I understand it's gotten better. At one point, it was the leading cause of occupational fatalities in this state. And I believe, talking to Mary with NIOSH, that it's commercial fishing now is number 1. But for a while there, they were competing against each other for number 1 spot. This is kind of a, you know, air taxis, that's the remainder of the United States, and the yellow, and Alaska is up there. And this is not just the number of accidents, folks. I know that, you know, every 5th person, 5th person, or 10th person has an airplane up here. This is an accident rate, which is a number of accidents per 100,000 flying hours. And worldwide, about 20% of these commercial CFIT accidents are this kind of thing. The top 5 GA accidents are loss of control, control flight into terrain, system component failure, power plant, low altitude, and unknown. Lots of unknown because we don't have the type of technology to record what happened in an accident. But you can see that the top 2 are also what results from a VFR into an unsuccessful VFR into IMC scenario. Okay? Interesting things. For the first time ever, a couple of years ago, 2011, the NTSB put general aviation safety on its most wanted list. They're concerned about the, what is it, almost 1,500 accidents a year. And so they actually put us on their list. They started this list back in 1990. In 2013, just last year, they came out with a safety alert for GA pilots, stressing the dangers of reduced visual references. And then, of course, this year, hazardous weather in GA operations is on its most wanted list. So this is a big concern for everyone, FAA, the NTSB, safety people. Obviously, adverse weather is a factor, poor visibility, cloud, precipitation, fog, all that together. Usually less than VFR weather minima, inadequate visual references. You know, visual VFR weather minimums are established in the belief that we would have enough room to safely maneuver our airplanes from other airplanes that might pop out of the cloud, and also from terrain. Unfortunately, some of these accidents have occurred in higher than VFR weather minimums. Okay? Another environmental factor is mountainous terrain. Kind of hard to read that, but there's a 40% higher accident rate, not just VFR into IMC, but any type of accident in mountainous states. And also in Alaska, 580%, this is a few years ago, probably 15 years ago, 580% greater risk of an accident, any kind of accident in Alaska. And again, of the 10 states with the highest BFR to IMC rates, 8 were in mountainous areas. And of course, Alaska is considered a mountainous state. And most of the accidents I looked at, the 13 were in mountainous terrain, not all of them. Nighttime is like a third thing, a third environment that's bad. Probably a 3 to 4 times greater chance of having this type of accident at night. And again, the US and Canada both raised their minimums in Class G or uncontrolled airspace to 3 miles of visibility at night. Only 3 of the accidents of the 13 that I saw were at night. One of them we just saw. So, like Clint said, the weather doesn't come up on the pilot comes up on the weather. It's not the mountains, it's not the weather, it's not night. It's the pilot that flies. Now, those 3 things are factors when you go flying at night or you go flying in the mountains. And heaven forbid if you decide to do both. You're elevating your risk factors, but you still are the one. All these pilots ultimately, either by active deliberation or passive default, continued into the adverse weather. And so we're going to talk a little bit about some strategies. Some of them are sort of psychological stuff and some of them aren't. Well, the first thing is, hey, as a pilot, there's always something new to learn about weather. Every pilot that I know is really an amateur weather forecaster. And if you're not, you should be aiming for that. So the sky's clear, perfectly clear on departure. It's a daytime flight. And you notice high cirrus cloud coming in from the west, followed by cirrostratus, and then lower altostratus, and then even lower nimbostratus. What type of weather system do you think is coming in? It's a typical warm front. And what we mean by typical, I mean, it's not always this kind of weather you're going to get, but typical with stable air, because all those layered clouds, those are all layered clouds, so generally it's stable. And so it looks like this. Warm fronts have extensive areas, and I'm talking hundreds of miles of low ceilings and visibilities, whereas cold fronts are generally, down to less than 100 miles sometimes. Again, it's not always the case, but this is typical. Here's another diagram here. You can see you've got the high cirrus here, and then it's followed by a completely overcast stratus, and then altostratus thicker, and then nimbostratus, and this whole part here is the messy part. You've got these little clouds here called stratus fractus or stratocumulus sometimes. Sometimes we just call them scud clouds. They're actually produced, and that's where we get the term scud running. They're actually produced by that precipitation falling into colder, dry air, and it reaches its dew point and saturation a lot earlier, and it starts to recondense, if you like, into cloud. And then you get even further and you just have fog. I mean, there is no way a VFR pilot can fly through that. And sometimes it extends for hundreds of miles. And of course, we don't know sometimes when we turn around, and so sometimes we like to take a look just to make sure, right? Another thing that you can do to maybe help protect yourself is to actually establish personal weather minimums. I know the FAA's talked about it and you've heard about it, and it just kind of goes through one ear and out the other. But commercial companies do this. They require their pilots in their ops manual to have, these are the minimums that you can fly this airplane in. And if the minimums are below that, you can say, sorry, I can't fly it, and that's great. And that's what you want to do. It's a layer of protection for yourself. And here's the other thing. If you're a brand new pilot, I see there's a few student pilots here, your minimums need to be definitely higher than VFR weather minimums. Especially knowing the fact that some of these accidents happen in higher than basic VFR weather minimum. And like some of the slide says here, it does provide a buffer between the demands of the situation and your own skill level. And you can go to the FAA, you can go to your flight instructor, there's all sorts of people that can help you try to develop your own personal weather minimums. The thing here is what these do is they protect you from flying low and slow under those clouds I just showed you. We call it scud running, okay? That's probably the number one thing that happens to VFR pilots. That's what kills them, is they just fly lower and lower, and they end up in the terrain or in the soup. Now, there was this study done, Canada, United States, Australia, I'm not sure who else was involved, and they took these pilots and put them in a simulator and simulated a VFR flight that gradually deteriorated down to IFR weather conditions. And they did lots of surveys and questions and other things. What they found was those pilots with the most liberal personal weather minimums actually were more likely to inadvertently fly into the IMC. They also found that most of the pilots, regardless, tended to overestimate visibility and also ceiling, but mostly visibility. And pilots who continued into the IMC had higher visibility estimates. So, you know, they sort of came up with something. One of the things they came up with, besides all this, is some pilots aren't very good at estimating what is 3 miles, what is 1 mile, what is 5 miles, and especially inexperienced pilots. So they don't know when they're actually getting close to IMC. One study found that the majority of pilots got a weather briefing, but a small or a large minority did get a weather briefing. It doesn't seem to matter. It's a good thing to get a weather briefing, but there are pilots who get a weather briefing, they know what the weather is, but they keep going anyway, okay? My take on this is the more briefings you get, the better you're going to be in understanding what they're telling you, and then again, back to what I said earlier, correlating that with what you see outside. The thing is, if the weather starts getting low, you need to start thinking about alternates early. You might not have to go to that alternate, but think about it early rather than later, okay? You want to leave yourself as many options as possible rather than to just bring it down to one option. So, you know, the mountains. You've got moist Pacific air, you've got mountains, you've got ceilings below the cloud tops, you've got these narrow winding corridors shaped like a V that we call valleys, and there's a limited number of them. And so your options automatically are reduced when you elect to fly through there. And then as you get closer and closer to where you want to go, the valley gets narrower and narrower, or the ceiling gets lower, and now you don't have room to turn. And I talked to a pilot who, and there's certain places on the planet that are more prone to this. I don't know if anyone's familiar with the Vancouver, British Columbia area, but if you fly from Winnipeg, Manitoba, which is like North Dakota, all the way to Vancouver, you can have wonderful weather until you get to a place called the Hope Slide area. And there's all sorts of metal on the sides of those mountains there because the valley gets lower and narrower, and the clouds get lower as you get into that Pacific moist air. And obviously your personal weather minimums need to be higher in the mountains than on the flat plains. And it's generally harder to see things at night, and that's why your minimums need to be higher at night, especially on a dark night where there's no moon or it's overcast sky, and that's a real problem. So you need to fly over well-lit terrain, you know, higher areas, obstacle clearance altitudes. On a sectional, you've got these max elevation figures, 2.2 there. That provides about 200 or 300 feet, it's the highest obstacle within that 30-minute by 30-minute quadrant. So maybe add 1,000 or 2,000 feet to it. If you're IFR, I'll go through these slides because in the interest of time, you can look at some of those as well. This one I have a little trouble talking about. How many are CFIs in here? Okay, as a CFI, we like to model good and safe behavior to our students. And so we generally don't fly in weather that would make our students uncomfortable or weather that we would want them to fly in. And that makes sense. That student flies in good weather the whole flight training experience. That may not make good sense because eventually they're going to fly and encounter bad weather. They're not going to know how to deal with it. So I get a lot of feedback on this one. I would say that it's probably good for a pilot to get some exposure to at least marginal VFR weather with an experienced instructor in an area that they're both familiar with, and just sort of say, okay, this is This is what would happen, this is what it might be like today if you're going en route through 2 or 3 different weather systems and you encounter this. What would you do? And so some of the things you can learn is you can identify what is adverse weather, figure out how to accurately judge ceiling and visibility values, determine what minimum safe altitudes are, always have a way out, all these things that many of you pilots here believe and preach, okay? Not to overfly your visibility, slow down, learn the techniques to do an off-airport procedure, a landing, and then of course recognize, hey, would you like to be flying in this somewhere you've never been before? See, there's a big difference between flying in lower weather in an area that you're really familiar with and then flying somewhere else where you've never been before. If you're a non-instrument rated pilot, you have a 5 times greater risk of having a VFR into IMC accident. So having an instrument rating means you can file when the weather is iffy, and it keeps you up above all that scud running stuff that we've been talking about. But here's the deal, a lot of instrument rated pilots have these types of accidents too. Half of those accidents that I looked at, those pilots were instrument rated. Some were not instrument current, but they were instrument rated. You know, despite what the airplane salesperson said to you, VFR in a light aircraft is one of the least reliable forms of transportation. And I know you have limits here in Alaska. What other ways can you get to your cabin, okay? You want to take a boat and then a ATV. I mean, you can't even do that, and it might take days. So I understand that, but it's still true, okay? You need to understand that too. I've read several reports where pilots were going to a funeral and they crashed at VFR into IMC. Even here in Alaska it happens. When you have to be somewhere, that's when you get into trouble. Sooner or later, if we think we have to be somewhere, sooner or later, if we fly enough, we're going to die in a plane crash. Okay, we are biased to continue. Just like pilots do not like to do go-arounds after a botched approach, we just like to keep going. That's what we're there for. So, just give you a quick rundown here. Most cigarette smokers, when they're asked, compared to other cigarette smokers, what's their likelihood of experiencing a smoking-related illness, a very high majority of them say their likelihood is much lower than the average smoker. Most Americans believe they're more intelligent than the average American. 93% of U.S. drivers believe they're better than other U.S. drivers. And when asked, this is from my area, when asked to compare yourself to your colleagues at your university, 94% of them say that they do above average work. Okay, so there's some optimistic and ability biases here. And I did some research several years ago with another colleague, and we also discovered the same thing. Most pilots believe they are less likely than others to experience a VFR into IMC, and they're more capable at extricating themselves out of such a situation. So these optimistic biases are actually part of a group of biases that is fairly normal in our lives. You don't want to walk around saying, oh, the sky is falling, you know, we're all going to die kind of thing. So being a little over-optimistic in life is actually a good thing. And the field of health psychology has also shown us that when we have a positive, optimistic view of life, our health is also better, generally. The problem with that is these attitudes that the FAA talked about, the invulnerability and the macho, the ability and optimistic biases can kind of get in the way sometimes. In fact, they discovered that people who are mildly depressed, not severely depressed, but mildly depressed, are actually more realistic and less optimistic about life than so-called healthy individuals like you and I. Let's say this is our comfort zone, and this is our discomfort zone, and outside of the red line is certain death in an aircraft accident. We tend to fly in our comfort zone, and as we get more experience, once in a while we experience something that's not in our comfort zone. The hairs on the back of our neck go up, and we're not very happy, but we get back into our comfort zone, and we feel good about that. And after a while, our comfort zone actually expands a little bit to maybe something like that. And that is actually perfectly normal, and it's a part of being an experienced pilot. The problem arises is how close do you get to that red line? That's the problem. That's the million-dollar question. And if we could all just figure out when we're in the cockpit, a magic light would go on and say, turn around, and you just totally trust it, and we wouldn't never have these accidents. But that's the issue right there. Some of us, our comfort zone, I mean, that 26,000-hour pilot, I don't know what the story is there, except that maybe his comfort zone was pretty big, and especially in an area he knew every tree, every turn in the river, all that kind of stuff. Your comfort zone does get pretty big. The problem is your margin of safety gets low. So if your comfort zone says, okay, if it's such a big comfort zone that 99.9% of the time I'm going to be safe, do you want that? What about that 0.1%? I mean, if you fly enough, you're going to eventually hit that 0.1%, right? And what happens is this becomes the new normal. The hair doesn't get up anymore. We don't start worrying. We cease to be afraid a little bit, and it's good to be a little bit afraid. So if you frame your go, no-go decision in terms of a certain losses of diverting hotels expenses, all these extra expenses and time, only just a chance of a loss, an accident, if you will, then you're likely to continue going. But if you frame it in terms of positives, you know, the certain gain of landing safely if I divert versus the uncertain gain of landing safely if I continue, it could make a difference on how you think about that. Statistics have actually shown that more VFR into IMC accidents occur on the last leg of a return trip home and closer to domicile because the desire to get home overrides our better judgment. And I looked at this. Actually, several of these Alaska accidents were pretty close to the destination. They were just almost there. And it was also several of them were the last leg of the day. A study happened in 2005. Air taxi operators with high fatal accident rates employed pilots who worked on average 10 hours more per week than pilots working for other operators. Research has proven when you're tired on that last flight of the day, on that last leg, on that last trip, your motivation is decreased, your risk-taking increases, and it's a real factor. Compared to other accidents, these types of accidents have a statistically significant higher proportion of passengers on board. 11 of these flights of the 13 had passengers on board, and 3 of them actually had other airplanes. They were what I call caravan flights. One was two airplanes, one was 3 airplanes, and one was 18 airplanes here in Alaska. And the leader of that crew, he went ahead to see what the weather was like, and he crashed, and fortunately the people following him realized that and turned around. 70% of 135 Alaska pilots did feel pressure. That's my 5-minute warning. From others to conduct high-risk flights. 50% admitted flying into VFR and IMC at least once. And I understand that you have over 250 communities here in Alaska that really rely on air transportation. I have no easy answers for that. But I can just point out to you what you probably already know in your heart, and that is there's pressure sometimes to fly. Sometimes it's just self-induced pressure. If you say no to your boss might grumble, but they'll usually say okay. You know, that's what makes a successful pilot, I guess, is get from A to B, and that can get us into trouble. We heard from ATC this morning. I'm sure they'd agree with this. Don't wait until it's too late to ask for help. They can get vectors, minimum altitudes, IFR clearances, assuming you know how to fly IFR, and your rated and so on. I like to say this, people laugh, don't be more afraid of the possible FAA repercussions than the hazardous weather itself. For you private pilots, the worst that's going to happen to you is you lose your certificate for a while. That's the worst. The best is probably a phone call and a slap on the wrist. Don't do it again. For you 135 pilots, this could be your whole career and your whole life. So you don't want to necessarily fess up to anything. You don't want to punch into the cloud and get an IFR clearance even though you weren't supposed to do that. So I understand that. A precautionary landing has saved a lot of pilots, and I understand that happens a lot up here. Pilots can land, we've got big Tundra tires, you can land on sandbars if you've got enough distance and stuff. And this has saved a lot of pilots, especially those who can't fly in the IFR environment. It's not without some risk, so get some training and some review on that in case you have to land somewhere. You know, this whole scenario is incremental. It kind of sneaks up on us. And, you know, we've flown in this weather before, and we have. So why can't I just keep going? And, you know, we don't know where our margin is. We don't know where the accident's going to happen. I bet you every pilot who's had an accident, if there was a little thing that could say, hey, in 2 minutes you're going to die in an accident, they would do something. But we don't have the magic bullet. And so what we need to do is we need to realize when we're in the pot and try and get ourselves out of the pot as fast as we can. In other words, you've heard this, but you want to avoid those situations that do make it difficult for you to get out of the pot. If you're in the soup, maintain your composure and maintain the aircraft control and get a hold of ATC. Conduct a 180-degree turn. If you're near high terrain, climb, get a hold of ATC, get help, and hopefully you can fly out of that situation. Okay, so try and recognize the adverse weather before you commit to it. Stick to those personal weather minimums, especially at night or in the mountains. Get an instrument rating, stay proficient. Realize that our own thinking is not always rational. We are biased to continue. If it doesn't feel right, it probably isn't, no matter what someone else may say. And again, don't be afraid to ask for help. And of course, you've heard this many times. Just wait it out if you can. Just don't go. You have to kind of frame it in such a way that, you know, remember Wilson up here. Remember this guy up here was preaching at you. He was telling you, hey, you're going to kill yourself if you're stupid, right? So don't be stupid, right?